The Loner Trail of Blood, Chapter 5 and 6. The next morning, Conrad telephoned the Damaris house and informed one of the servants that he wouldn't be able to accept Mrs. Damaris's kind invitation to tea. He asked the woman to tender his regrets to Celeste and had just hung up the instrument when a knock sounded on the door of the suite sitting room. He started to open it himself, but Arturo got there first. As the valet swung the door open, a man's voice said, "I'm here to see Browning." "Mr. Browning may or may not be available," Arturo replied archly. "I sure have to tell him who is calling." The man looked over Arturo's shoulder, pointed and said, "He's standing right there, and I can see he's not doing anything but drinking coffee." Arturo waited, his posture indicating he wouldn't budge though the visitor outweighed him by at least 100 pounds. "All right," the man growled after a moment. "Tell him Jack Mallory is here." "Very well." Arturo turned toward Conrad. "Sir, Mr. Mallory here to see you." "Send him in." Conrad tried not to smile. "Please come in," Arturo told Mallory as he moved aside and gestured for the visitor to enter. With an impatient shake of his head, Mallory stepped into the room. He was tall and brawny with heavy shoulders and long arms. He carried himself like a prize fighter, Conrad thought. His gray suit didn't fit him very well. Rusty stubble sprouted on the belligerent jaw despite the early hour. His rumpled thatch of hair was the same shape. He carried a hat in one big knuckle hand. "I'm Conrad Browning." Conrad introduced himself and shook hands with Mallory. "Would you like some coffee?" "Sure. If you want to splash a little cognac in there, I wouldn't complain." Conrad raised an eyebrow in surprise. He would have figured Mallory for more of a straight whiskey drinker. "I'm afraid we don't have any cognac." Mallory shrugged. "Black will be fine, then." Conrad nodded to Arturo, who poured coffee from the pot on a sideboard into a fine china cup. Mallory took it, handling the cup with more deftness than Conrad would have expected from such a big, rough-looking man. "I'm told you're the best detective in Boston, Mr. Mallory," Conrad said. "It's strange. I used to live here, and I don't ever recall hearing your name." "Not that strange," Mallory said with a shake of his head. "I've only been here about a year. If you'd been gone longer than that, you never would have heard of me. Where were you before that?" "Down in Mexico, working for a mining company that was having trouble getting their ore shipments out. Before that, I was in Central America, seeing to it that a bunch of guerrillas didn't keep a railroad from getting built. And before that, knocking around here and there, I worked for the Pinks off and on." "But you're not a Pinkerton operative at the moment?" Mallory shook his head. "I have my own office." "You spent time in some rough places. What made you decide to settle in Boston?" "I never said I was settling here. There are parts of Boston where you can get killed quicker than any Central American jungle." Conrad nodded. "I suppose that's true." Mallory drank some of the hot, strong coffee. "You sent word for me to come here and talk with you for a reason, Mr. Browning. Why don't you tell me what that reason is, and we'll see whether or not we can do business." Of course, Conrad wasn't comfortable with a lot of small talk either. He appreciated the detective's business. "I want to hire you to find a woman." Mallory frowned. "Let me guess, you want to be reunited with some long-lost love?" "Not hardly," Conrad snapped. "This woman is dead, and if hate wasn't such a useless emotion, I think I would probably hate her with every fiber of my being." Mallory's bushy red eyebrows rose a little as he tugged at his right earlobe. "That sounds a little more interesting. Why don't you tell me about it?" Conrad explained about his history with Pamela Tarleton and a posthumous letter he had received from her a couple weeks earlier. He hated to open up and reveal his pain to the stranger, but if Mallory was going to help him, the detective had to know the background. The two of them had sat down while Conrad was talking. When he finished the story, Mallory asked, "What is it you want me to do?" "I think it's quite likely Pamela gave birth to the children at some private hospital or sanatorium in this area. If she did, it's possible she might have shared some of the details of her plan with someone there, a doctor or a nurse maybe. I want you to find out if that's true. Conrad leaned forward in a comfortable armchair and clasped his hands together. But that's not all. To be completely honest with you, Mr. Mallory, I don't believe Pamela Tollerton was quite sane. She blamed me not only for ending our engagement, but also for her father's death. It's none of my business, but did you have anything to do with that? Conrad shook his head. Clark Tollerton was killed by an assassin hired by one of his crooked business partners. Pam never really accepted that. I suppose it was easier for her to blame me. So she was loco, as they say down in Mexico, Mallory replied. What's your point? I've been going on the assumption that what Pamela said in the letter about the twins is true, although I'm not fully convinced she's hidden them somewhere on the frontier. It seems to me it would have been much easier for her to conceal them somewhere here in the East, where she's more accustomed to things. However, everything Pamela said has to be doubted on some level. Mallory tugged at his earlobe again and slowly nodded in understanding. You don't know for sure there really are any twins. That's right. Conrad stood up, put his hands behind his back, and began to pace. It's possible the entire thing is nothing but a vicious hoax, intended to cause me more pain. That would do it all right, the detective must. Tell a man he has children he doesn't know about, send him on a wild goose chase looking for them, and then he's crushed when he finally finds out they don't exist. Conrad stopped his pacing and jerked his head in a nod. Exactly. That's just the sort of warped cruelty that might have occurred to Pamela. So you want me to find out where she had the kids, not just to help you locate them, but to prove that they actually exist? Yes. Will you do it? Your fee and expenses will be no object. Mallory got to his feet and Grit held out his hand. I won't soak you, he gripped Conrad's hand. You strike me as a decent sort of gent, Browning. I'll do what I can to help you. Thank you. I'll have my secretary write you a bank draft before you leave. Just tell Arturo how much you need. What you do in the meantime, Mallory wanted to know. You don't seem to me like a man who sits back and waits for somebody else to do all his work for him. Conrad smiled. I have my own avenues of investigation to explore. Consider it a race if you like, Mr. Mallory, a race for the truth. One of those avenues of investigation opened up that afternoon. A messenger arrived at the hotel with a note for Conrad. When he broke the seal on it and unfolded it, the scent of expensive perfume rose from the paper. Arturo had taken the note from the messenger and handed it to Conrad. He caught a quizzical eyebrow but didn't come right out and ask what it was about. Conrad told him anyway. This is an invitation to dinner tonight, Arturo, at Mrs. Beatrice Garrison's house. She apologizes for the lateness of the invitation, but says she only heard today that I'm back in Boston. I'm afraid the name means nothing to me, sir, although it clearly does to you. The late Mr. Wilbur Garrison owned Texel Mills, a shipping line, and everything else he could get his fat, greedy hands on. When his heart gave out in his mistress's bed, his wife intended everything and became one of the wealthiest women in the Northeast. She's a prominent figure in Boston society. Ah, then, I take it no one else knows about the ominous activities that cost her late husband his life. On the contrary, Conrad smiled. Practically everyone knows about them. But members of high society never allow the truth to interfere with their illusions. I know what I'm talking about, because for a long time I was the same way. Having seen you in action, sir, I find that difficult to believe. Believe it. There was a time when I was the most pompous, piggish stuffed shirt you could ever hope to see. My mother, rest her soul, tried to help me grow up, but it took a couple of other people to finally accomplish that. A couple people named Frank Morgan and Rebel Callahan. Conrad put away the thoughts of his father and his late wife and went on. It's short notice to get a tuxedo fitted and altered in time for dinner this evening, so we better get busy. The jacket is going to be especially tricky. Why is that, sir? I'll have to be cut so you can't see the guns. Chapter 6. When attending a dinner party in one of Boston's most elegant Beacon Hill mansions, most people wouldn't have felt the need to go on with anything more than a gracious smile, a quick wit, and good manners. But Conrad felt naked when he wasn't packing iron. The alterations on the tuxedo had been hurried but expert. The price he paid ensured that, when he climbed out of the carriage in front of Mrs. Beatrice Garrison's house that evening, no one could tell he carried a .38 caliber revolver under each arm. The hoisters had been removed from the cross-drawer rig he wore during the train tramp and attached to a special shoulder harness that was visible under his clothes. Being armed like that wasn't particularly comfortable, but the weight of the guns was certainly reassuring. Conrad didn't expect any trouble at Mrs. Garrison's party, especially the kind that require hot lead, but he was ready just in case. A servant met him at the door and took his hat and walking stick. Conrad vaguely recognized the old butler. "So good to see you again, Mr. Browning," the man murmured. "Welcome back to Boston." "Thank you, Charles," Conrad said, coming up with the butler's name. "I trust that Mrs. Garrison is well?" "Very well, sir. She and the guests who have already arrived are in a solar room. Do you remember her your way?" "Yes, I do. Thank you." Conrad started along a richly carpeted hallway lined with sober portraits of generations of wealthy Garrisons, thinking of the many dinners and balls he, his mother, and stepfather had attended at that house. The solar room was a high-ceilinged room with numerous tall windows. Boston wasn't blessed with the sunniest climate in the world. Those people wouldn't know what hot sunlight was until they'd been through the Jornada de Muerto. During the day, the room took advantage of what sunlight there was, but the curtains had been drawn against the dark night. A servant handed Conrad a drink as soon as he stepped into the room. He sipped the champagne and moved toward the cluster of people around the short, stout, white-haired figure in a glittering dress and an abundance of brilliant jewelry. "Conrad Browning," the woman cried happily when she spotted him. "Dear boy, I thought you had deserted us forever." The beautifully dressed crowd parted to let him through. He took the hand Mrs. Garrison extended to him, bent over it, and pressed his lips to the back. "How wonderful to see you again," she went on. "We won't stand on ceremony. Come here and give your Aunt Beatrice a hug." She wasn't really his aunt, of course, but she and his mother had been close friends. Conrad hugged her, being careful not to spill his drink. He kissed her rug and pouted cheek. Her blue eyes sparkled as she looked up at him. "You should be ashamed of yourself." "Why?" he asked, smiling. "First of all, for taking that charming wife of yours and abandoning Boston in the first place." She grew serious as he placed a beringed hand on his arm. "I was so sorry to hear about Rebel. She was very different from the sort of woman to whom we're accustomed around here. But I could tell she was very good for you, my boy. I liked her a great deal." "She liked you too," Conrad said softly. Although two women couldn't have been more different than Rebel and Mrs. Garrison. They both had a streak of honesty a mile wide. Mrs. Garrison had known perfectly well her late husband was a pirate in the Leech. She had chosen to deal with it by not dealing with it. "And you let all of us believe for the longest time that you were dead. Didn't it ever occur to you to let your friends know you were alive?" "I've been busy." That was an understatement. Every time Conrad had turned around, he had been mixed up in some gun ruckus or another. He had fought outlaws, land grabbers, and bounty hunters. He had come within a whisker of dying more times than he liked to think about. He had slept on the hard ground, gone hungry, and been tortured. Thoughts of Boston society hadn't really entered his mind. "Well, now you're back, hopefully for good," Mrs. Garrison went on. "I won't monopolize your time. I'm sure everyone here wants to speak to you." Conrad didn't tell her he wasn't planning to stay in Boston a minute longer than he had to, and spent the next half hour exchanging greetings, small talk, and pleasantries with the other guests, with all of whom he was acquainted. Joseph and Celeste Demers were there. Celeste pouted a little as she said, I was so disappointed you couldn't come to tea this afternoon, Conrad. I had to get ready for this evening. He lowered his voice. Can't disappoint Mrs. Ganson, you know. And I was sure I sent you and Joseph here. See you and Joseph here. Of course, Joseph said. Conrad, you and I really should have lunch sometime while you're here. I know you say you want in Boston to do business, but it never hurts to consider your options. I'll think about it, Conrad promised, which was an utter lie. What would these people do, he asked himself, if they knew that only a few months ago he had been locked up in Gale-Hate prison, a beaten, half-starved wretch? What would they think of all the men he had killed? How would they react if he told them about gunning down the bastards who had murdered his wife? Ignoring his thoughts, he smiled and chatted, and none of it meant a damn thing. The party was just an order to be indoor until he found out what he needed to know. No one had mentioned Pamela Tarleton or her father by the time everyone was called into the dining room. They had to be curious, but Conrad knew they were avoiding the subject, like they always avoided talking about anything unpleasant. He was willing to bide his time. After dinner, the guests moved into the ballroom for dancing. Conrad tried to plead a stiff leg, but Celeste Damaris dragged him onto the floor anyway. As they circled the room to the music of a string quartet, Celeste said, "You must be terribly lonely these days, Conrad. I don't mean to remind you of your loss, but I worried about you." He doubted if she had spared a thought for him until he showed up unexpectedly in Boston again, but he didn't let that show on his face. "I try to keep myself busy. It helps not to think about things you know. Well, if you ever need someone to talk to or simply a soft shoulder on which to rest your head for a while, you know where to find me." "Indeed I do," he said, making her flush with pleasure. "Things have certainly changed in the past few years. 5 years ago it would have been Pamela in my arms." "Pamela?" Celeste repeated. For a second her face hardened. "That was a dreadful thing, you know." He thought she meant how Pamela had died from a gunman's bullet in a tiny New Mexico settlement, and the Celeste went on. "The way she shut herself up in her house was just tragic. She never saw anyone for months at a time. At least no one in our circle. I assume she saw her servants. She isolated herself because she was too ashamed to show her face after. Oh, Conrad, don't get me wrong. No one blames you for breaking off the engagement. I don't know what actually happened. It was all shrouded in some sort of cloak of mystery, but I'm sure you had perfectly good reasons for doing what you did. Probably more than one reason. Pamela was always rather. Celeste couldn't find the words. Conrad could have supplied them. Vicious, scheming, insane. It was a terrible time for all of us, he murmured. "I'm sure it was. Such a shame, such a shame. So she never saw anyone?" "Not that I'm aware of." That made sense. Pamela hadn't wanted anyone to know she was pregnant. Then, after a year or so, she went away again, so let's continue. No one knew where. We heard later that she had been killed in some sort of accident out west somewhere. A shudder went through her delicate frame. What a dreadful place to die. Before either of them could say anything else, Joseph Damaris tapped Conrad on the shoulder. "Could I trouble you for my wife back?" he asked with a smile. "Of course," Conrad said as he handed over Celeste, who didn't bother hiding her disappointment at having to dance with her husband. Conrad walked over to Mrs. Garrison, who was watching the dancers with a faint smile on her face. "A lovely evening, as always," he said. "Thank you, dear boy." She linked her arm with his. "How are you holding up?" "The loss of you suffer, first your wife and then Pamela." "Pamela was nothing to me," he said bluntly. Mrs. Garrison's lip tightened in disapproval. "The two of you were once engaged to be married." "That was a long time ago." "You would have been a good match." "I don't think so." Mrs. Garrison waved her other hand. "Oh, not as good as you and Rebel, of course, but still. It's a shame that things didn't work out. I heard that she shut herself up in her house and stayed there for a year." "Indeed. I suppose she was in mourning for what she had lost when you broke your engagement to her. With all due respect, Aunt Beatrice, I don't intend to explain myself." "I'm not asking you to. What remained between the two of you can remain between the two of you as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, it's obvious you met Rebel, and that was the end of Pamela." Do you know where she went and when she left Boston after that? The old woman shook her head. I'm afraid not. There's a rumor she was killed. It's true, Conrad said with a nod. He didn't mention that he'd been there when it happened. A terrible shame. First Clark and then her. But these things happen, I suppose. I'd like to know more about what she did during those days. Mrs. Garrison frowned up at him. I thought you washed your hands of the poor girl. That's true, but I'm curious. Do you think you could ask around for me? Her eyes narrowed. You want me to be a gossip magon for you, is that it? Not exactly, he sighed. I just like to get everything straight in my mind at last so I can put it all behind me and get on with the rest of my life. Her expression relented a little. I suppose I can understand that. I felt the same way when Wilbur passed on. Sometimes the knowledge is bitter, but it's better for us to go ahead and swallow it and be done with it. That's true. All right, I'll see what I can find out. She squeezed his arm. I knew you must still be in pain, and when I heard that you couldn't bring yourself to go back to your mother's house and were staying in a hotel, I'll do whatever I can to help you, Conrad. He kissed her cheek. Thank you. I warned you, though. Sometimes when we look for the truth, we find out things we would have rather not known. She didn't know how well acquainted with that idea he already was. He and the bitter truth were already old friends.